Welcome back to another Godot tutorial. Finally, it has been about time. So today we will be building this thing in the background, a circular shader you could say, and I hope you'll learn something. Let's jump right in. So to achieve this effect there are a ton of different ways of doing it. Today we are going to build a shader, and even using a shader there are still a lot of different ways of doing it. So as you can see here in Godot, I already created a scene with a background and a color rect called effect. And on there I put a shader material with a shader. And in this shader I already added some starting code, so we save some time. The first step would be to build a way that we can manipulate the existing UV information and create polar coordinates. This involves a bit of math, but we will go through each step individually and I will show you the visual representation of the step, so in the end you will hopefully be able to pull it off on your own the next time. And if you don't care, I will put a marker in the video so you can just jump to the end of the process of creating those polar coordinates and you can continue with the shader. It will be much easier and you can then just copy and paste the code and use it for your own effect. To start, let's create a circle in the shader. And to do that, first we need a new uniform, vector2. And let's call this center. And let's set it by default to vector2 0 5 0 5. And in the fragment part of the shader, let's make a new vector2. Let's call it direction. And in here, let's take the existing UV minus the center. And now let's visualize it using color. So with this code, color equals vector4 dir.x dir.y 0 1. We are going to assign this x to the red, this to the green, blue will be 0 and alpha will be 1. And you can see up here how it looks. You'll also notice that these parts are black, just to make it easier to visualize what we just did. Let's add an absolute here, and you can now see what happens pretty exactly. So this is minus 0.5 and up here it's also minus 0.5. The next step will be to calculate the radius. So for the radius we create a new float, and in here we just take the length of dir that we just created, and let's see how this looks. So you can now see we already have a circle. But because it's from 0.5 to 0.5 and we want it to be from minus 1 to 1, we need to multiply it with 2. And now you can see we have a perfect circle. The edges are 1 and the center is 0. Okay, so what we need to continue to create our polar coordinates would be a value that is going from 0 to, let's say, 1 around the texture in a circle, like a clock face basically. To create that we need the atan function, the arctangent function. I want to explain it in just a short overview because I always struggled with such things. I didn't have a very good math education, so I try to explain it in a way that it's understandable. And let's draw a grid on it, because basically what we have in our shader, it's a coordinate grid. So this center here will be 0, 0. If we go back here, the dir value in the center is 0.0. If we go to the right, we have a value of 0.5 on the x-axis and 0 on the y-axis. And if we go down, we have 0 and 0.5 on the y-axis. What the arctangent function does, and in this case we're going to use atan in the shader, it's atan2 function. If we put in atan and then the input would be x and y, it would give us the angle to this direction. Basically, if you imagine a big circle around here with this coordinates, it will give us the angle of this direction. In this case it will be 0. If we use these coordinates, what we will get is minus 1.5 blah blah blah. So back in our shader, let's put this new knowledge to use. Let's create a new float called angle. And let's use the atan function. And atan takes different values, as you could just see in the hint. We can use a vector 2 and then it will be effectively an atan 2. So let's just use dir.x and dir.y. And let's not do anything further. Let's not overcomplicate it for the first look. Let's see what we got here. So it's not looking too bad, but it's not a full circle. It's like half a circle. So what we need to do is to divide this result by tau, or basically 2 times pi. So let's make a new constant and let's call it tau, and that equals 6.2832 or something like that. Should be fine. Oh, of course, a float. Let's take this and let's divide this by our tau. And now you can see it's much more even, although it still goes from minus 0.5 to 0.5. We could now do a plus 0.5 like this, and we would have like a perfect mapped circle. But in our case, we don't even need that because we're going to use it as UV coordinates. So for UV coordinates, apart from the offset, it's essentially doing the same thing. So let's just save this extra calculation in our case, and we're fine like this. So we have created our polar coordinates, and also we have the radius. So if we combine these two, what we get is exactly what we need to achieve the effect that I showed you in the beginning of the video. So let's use what we just created. Let's create a new uniform sampler to the, let's call it image texture. And in here we are going to use this. And as a UV, we're going to use vector 2, angle, and radius. The image texture was put here, and it's pretty much the effect that I want. So far, we wrapped our texture around this area. We have a little artifact going on here. We wrap this and do our plus 0.5 that we talked about earlier in the video. And now at least we have this not in the middle of the image, but at the border of the image. So if we use another image, it will not have this ugly line going on in the middle of the image, but just at the edge. And if we're careful, we just don't put any information there. Let's keep it black, and that's it. What else can we do? We could multiply this. For example, we could multiply this by 2, and then we would have this. And we can also multiply the radius to change this amount of, let's say, zoom or something like that, scale. Because we probably want to play around with these values, let's put all of this code here into a new function. So let's create a new vector 2 function, because that will be what it returns. Let's call it coordinates. And it takes a vector 2 called UV, and it takes a vector 2 called center. And then we just need to paste this code here, paste it here. And instead of this UV here, we use this. And instead of this center, effect center. By the way, we can also remove this. So now it's a bit clearer. And yeah, we return a vector 2 of angle and radius. And now in here we can use our new function, and let's give it UV and effect center. And then you can see it works right away. We moved it out of the way, made our fragment code a little bit cleaner. So because we want to play around with these values, let's add 2 more uniforms. We need 2 floats. Let's call it effect scale, repeat maybe, effect repeat. Scale, let's set it to a default of 1, and repeat, let's set it to a default of 2. And with these 2 values, we could do this, repeat. And up here in this function, we're going to add these 2 new scale and repeat. And let's just multiply the radius with the scale and the angle with repeat. And like this, we're now able to easily manipulate these coordinates. What I also want to add is a way to manipulate how the UV coordinates work. So let's add a new uniform called UV mod in my case. Let's put it on a default value of 1. And let's multiply those with UV mod. So right now it's not doing a whole lot, but if I, for example, put this to -1, nothing happens because this is symmetrical, but in this case we can flip the image. And sometimes it's practical to flip a texture and we don't have to rework the whole thing. So yeah. And if you see here, we can also change the center. Now we have a bit more control about the effect. This down here is getting quite big, so let's create a new vector 2. Let's call it just UV. And let's do this. And like this, it's going to look a bit more clean. And we can continue working on the effect. So now we got the polar coordinates out of the way, everything is set up, we can start making it look pretty. First thing would be to add another sampler to the, let's call it image multiplier. And let's also move this color thing a bit up here. So let's put this here. We could put this all into one line, but then it would look messy like hell. So let's multiply this with image, texture, image, multiplier, and UV. So we don't want to use the UV coordinates, the polar coordinates for this one. So now we can add another texture, another sampler 2D, and in this case I'm going to use gradient texture 2D. If you don't have that, because the effect that we are about to build is basically also a circular gradient. If you don't have this, you're probably on an older version of Godot, and then you will have to prepare an image somewhere else, or you can also use a gradient texture and then remap it with the polar coordinates, but it will be a bit more complicated. I will, in this example, just use gradient texture 2D. So let's create a new gradient. Let's make it a bit bigger, otherwise it could be that we can see some of those lines. You can see now that it multiplies with the image. So what I want to do is to use a radial mode, and I also want to put it from 0.5 and let's put it into the center. So now we have another radial texture in the center multiplying our base image. Let's go into the gradient and let's start manipulating it a bit. Let's pull up this black and pull down this slider. And maybe you can already see where this is going. We will recreate this effect from the original game. And yeah, let's stay like this. And it already looks a bit more interesting. So the next step, and this is much more interesting, let's create a new uniform called speed, or scroll speed would be even more precise. Let's put it to a default value of 0.0. Let's take this UV that we use here and say plus time and multiply it with our scroll speed. And what we can do with this is to add this effect here. And maybe slowly it starts looking a bit like the effect that you remember from the intro. We can also add some side scrolling. So now it's going into the right direction. Let's play around with the texture. Let's just add some different texture and you can see that it doesn't work. Why is that? If we look into the texture import settings, repeating is disabled. And because of this, if the UV coordinate is bigger than 1, it won't work. So let's add a little failsafe to our shader. Let's add a mod here, a modulation. Let's set it to 1.0 and you can see now it works again. So you can now play around with different textures and you can create pretty interesting effects. So this shader is really flexible. You can use it to create all kind of effects. For example, stuff like this. You can also increase the repeat to play around with this. You can see now the effect slowly rotates on its own. There are thousands of combinations that you can do with this shader, and especially if we start to combine it with more and more images. So let's create another texture like the image multiplier. Image add. Let's give it a simple name, and we can then just say image text plus equal the same from here, and let's say image add, and maybe we should add a hint black here so it doesn't go crazy if we don't add a texture. Let's add another gradient texture 2D, and also let's set it to radial, and just like the last time, put it in the center. And now we can use this to add some color, or in this case I'm still working with black and white values. You can see we can achieve some pretty cool effects. And we could also clamp the value, but we can just also do it like this. Let's reduce it a bit. Let's pull this down. Also play around with these values. And now in the end, what I always like to do on such effects is to not color it in a flat way, but add another gradient. Let's call it image gradient tint. And in this case, let's use texture lot like this, and take the gradient tint. And right now we can just do this. And now it will be black, no problem. We need to add a gradient here. We can use a normal gradient for this. And now what we will get is the same result. It looks basically the same as before. The only thing that we need to add is to clamp this, this value here. So let's clamp this down to 0 and 1. And we also want to have another multiplier on the final effect. So let's add another uniform, and let's call it extra power. And by default, it's going to sit at a 1. And let's multiply this with extra power after clamping, like this. And I also multiply this with the extra power. So let's change this color here, and you will see what we just did. Let's select a nice purple, or just keep this at white, and here in between we select a nice purple. And now we have a lot of control about the appearance of the final effect. We can create some really nice gradients into the effect, and with extra power we have a lot of control about this, how this effect looks, how the colors are going to be applied. Yeah, and all that's left to do now is to play around with textures. You can just use different textures for this effect, and whoops, we have to take care about alpha. Eventually we want to handle this in a certain graceful way, but anyway. If we use a different texture, we can create a lot of different effects, and sometimes it's really cool what you get with just playing around with textures. And you can also add more and more layers. For example, if I look at this image texture, I can totally imagine using that for an additional effect to overlay it, make it more interesting. And in my game, I created a custom texture that looks a bit like a circuit board. And yeah, if I play around with these effects here, and now you can probably slowly recognize this effect from the final game. And here we go. This is where I will wrap up the video, and I think it gives you enough directions to recreate the effect in 3D if you like. You can just copy some billboard code, add our code to it, and then you will have basically the same result as a billboard texture. You can also use this texture for a particle system or this effect for a particle system. Just use it as the particle material shader, not the process material. And as always, I recommend combining different effects. For example, I just added this particle 2D and it gives it a completely different appearance. So combining different layers of effects, you can also combine different layers in a shader, usually results in a more interesting effect. If you want to see more effects like this, check out my game Beat Invaders on Steam. It's made in Godot and it's full of effects, so maybe you can get some inspiration from it. I hope this tutorial was helpful for you, and if it was, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. I plan to upload more stuff in the future. It was quite a long pause, I know, I'm sorry, but we will fix that in the future. So like and subscribe and see you the next time. Bye!